request I got from my community was to talk about how being a game dev changes your perspective of other games. How does the fact that you've made games before affect the way you interact with other games? The first thing is that it gives you more perspective. While in a lot of cases you'll probably be wrong, you can often come up with a very plausible reason why a particular design decision was made. Why did they decide to make you be so slow when you walk through grass? Oh, I bet it was because they had a performance problem. They needed to slow down how quickly you could move through the content. Are you right? You might not be right. At least it gives you a grounding on which to draw some semi-informed conclusions. You know how difficult it is to make an asset, so you understand the cost that went into the assets that you're seeing. This can end up manifesting in very diametrically opposed ways. For some people, and I would like to put myself in this camp, it gives you more empathy for the design decisions for the games that you're playing. While you may experience design decisions, art direction, story decisions that aren't the things that you personally would have done, because you understand that making games is hard, because you understand the work that went into making the game that you're playing, it gives you a certain degree of grace in the way that you interact with other games. It makes you a little bit more forgiving for things that maybe aren't to your taste. For other people, it actually has the opposite effect. Because they are an artist and this isn't the art direction decision that they would have made, it makes them actually more dismissive, more willing to criticize things that are done by other people for other reasons. Not a behavior that I would condone, but you have the tools to crap on other things more effectively if that's the personality that you happen to have. I think that just makes you an extra shitty person, but you do see people like that as well. One of the downsides of this knowledge is that it is incomplete. You don't know the situation that the dev team that made the game you're playing was in. You don't know necessarily the engine that they were using, or the time constraints they had, or the team that they were working with. So if you are criticizing a decision they made because you see it as lazy, because you could have done it in just a couple of extra days, maybe they didn't have a couple of extra days. Maybe their team didn't have a VFX artist and they were working around that gap. One place that you actually see this manifest quite often inside the development process is former devs who have moved into more senior positions. Back in my day, we could have made a level like this in 3 days. Why in the world is it taking us 7 months? But of course, back in your day, you couldn't make a level like this at all. Things are radically different. Your knowledge is out of date and misapplied. So when we look at other games, there's a similar fog of war that descends, where our knowledge, while somewhat applicable, has gaps in it, and that limits our ability to make fully informed decisions. For me, that's why empathy is the starting point. Have a willingness to assume there's a reason behind the decisions that were made, as opposed to jumping to, that's not what I would have done, you're being lazy, there's something wrong here. Assume there's something you don't know. Certainly, one thing that does come from working in game development is a sensitivity to things. So when I play a game like Baldur's Gate 3, Game of the Year, Baldur's Gate 3, I see a ton of bugs around the edges, polish bugs, characters floating off the ground, animation glitches, little bits and bobs of cruft that I am aware of, whereas before I worked in game development, I never would have even noticed these things. That awareness can lead you to having difficulty enjoying those games. Some people who work in game dev play less and less games as time goes on because that sensitivity that comes from working in game dev, that sensitivity that causes you to see all these little bugs and little problems, this little bits of friction that exist in all games, reduce your enjoyment of games. For other people, it becomes part of the experience. You notice all these little things, but they are in all games. So you notice them, you're aware of them, but you enjoy them all the same. People who are not familiar with game development at all sometimes radically underestimate the cost of doing something. Something that is a bit in the past at this point, but certainly was fairly common in the past, was the just make this game multiplayer. You just have to put in some network code and you're done. It'll take a couple of days. This incredibly uninformed opinion about how difficult something is, and even the kinds of work required to do something. To make a game multiplayer is way more work than simply making two versions of the game talk to each other. And that in and of itself is a massive amount of work. But to make a game multiplayer, you have to make two versions of the game talk to each other. You might have to create and implement an entire server code stack. But you also need to consider the design of your game and make sure that that actually works in a multiplayer setting. And it impacts the way you do storytelling. And because you have less control over where characters are standing and what they're doing, it might end up impacting your art implementation. If you've worked in games, if you have, most importantly, shipped a game, it gives you a greater appreciation for the difficulty in implementing different features, in the things that come up that you may not otherwise have thought of. If you've started a game but never shipped it, you can be unaware of the massive amount of work that is required to make a feature ready to ship. If you've never shipped a AAA game, you may not be aware of the amount of additional polish that goes into features in AAA games that might not be there in indie games. Now, I think there's an argument to be made in that case that maybe that polish shouldn't be there, but it is there right now, so features in AAA take longer than features in indie. Having worked in games, having, most importantly, shipped games, helps you understand a lot of the hidden costs that aren't immediately obvious if you haven't done those things. So I guess the TLDR of this question is that what working in games does is it makes you more aware of the way that games are made. In some cases, that awareness might be quite narrow if you have only ever worked as a visual effects artist and you haven't tried to expand or extend your awareness of the other parts of the development. That might be all you have any particular awareness of. And all of that ignorance around the other aspects of game development might remain to some degree. But mostly, for most people, even if you're not trying, an awareness of the difficulty of all the parts of game development rubs off on you to some degree. So that can allow you to be a bit more forgiving. That can allow you to give games a bit more of benefit of the doubt. But it doesn't always work that way. And in some cases, people actually just become more informed assholes when it comes to interacting with other games. Now, I'm somewhat dodging one category of games in this discussion, and I think it's probably worth talking about that as well. And those games are games that are actually low effort. So asset flips, things like that, where people are going on to an asset store for the engine that they're using, and they're downloading a pre-made shooter or a pre-made survival game, and then they are plugging in pre-made assets. It's interesting with this style of game. I would say that for me, a game like that is probably getting more benefit of the doubt than it deserves. Because I'm sensitive to how difficult games are to make, even a game like that can get more grace, more benefit of the doubt than it probably deserves. But with those kinds of games, you kind of feel the lack of effort leaking out of the game, coming out of the screen as you're playing them. The awareness of the effort that it takes to make a game also means that to some degree you have an awareness when that effort wasn't expended. When they're truly asset flips, they cross from, I see what this game was trying to do. They made decisions that aren't the decisions that I would have made, but I can respect those decisions and appreciate the attempt, and cross into something almost offensive. This is a affront to the craft of game development. This isn't even trying. It isn't making design decisions at all. It's just pouring a bunch of assets into a blender and then calling it a day. It isn't that it has some minor aesthetic bugs or an unfortunate technical bug that's caused from a hardware incompatibility. It's filled with bugs. It doesn't even look like they tried to play it at all. And these aren't bugs caused by edge cases. These exist right down the middle of the path. There can be some pretty interesting indie titles that on their surface look an awful lot like asset flips, but actually explore really interesting spaces. A designer working on their own might download an existing game framework and download existing assets, but then make a unique twist on the shooter genre. So in the first opening seconds, it looks like this is a zero effort asset flip. But as you play it and explore it, you see the effort coming through. An artist might make a game that is very much like other games that are out there, but looks different and explores a different visual space. A programmer might be exploring different technical space. Again, feeling the effort coming through, feeling the work and experience that the game developer or developers put into the game that you're playing. You should reuse assets. I'm on record in being pro asset reuse. But if all you do is glue together a bunch of existing things without applying something of your own to that, whether it be a design perspective or a technical perspective or an artistic perspective or an audio perspective, whatever, if all you're doing is pushing a bunch of assets together until they kiss and calling that a game, that's low effort. If you are doing that and then applying something of your own on top of that, that can be really interesting. A final thing that happens when you've worked in game development is that awareness of the difficulty of certain things can make you appreciate features or implementations that may not be that impressive to other gamers. There are games out in the world that I call game developer games that are impressive to game developers. A classic example is the Pikmin series. Pikmin is effectively an RTS built for the consoles. And it is impressive in its interface, in how it gets you to control your little army of Pikmin and interact with the world, because it's designed for the consoles and it is working on a very limited input set. And that's really cool and really impressive to someone who's worked in game development, to someone who's tried to make their complicated RPG fit on one of these things. Whereas to the average gamer, if it's working, it's invisible. It's just something that they play and they enjoy or don't enjoy, and it doesn't elevate the game. Much like you have areas of music like experimental jazz and some parts of the hip hop scene, which can be difficult for people from the outside of those scenes to understand and appreciate. There are features within game development that are impressive to game developers that may not be as impressive to other people. So at the end of the day, my answer is that working in game development increases your awareness of the game itself, but the impact that has on your actual enjoyment of a game is highly dependent upon the person, highly dependent upon what you bring to your experience of playing. So it gives you the skills to understand the game better. It gives you the skills to see the flaws better. But whether or not that increases or decreases your enjoyment of the game is really coming down to you. A special thanks to my members. They provide the resources that this channel needs to keep running. If you're interested in becoming a member, there will be a link to that down in the description. We also have a Patreon if you would like to support us in that way. Both members and Patreons get access to our Discord. So if you would like to interact with the community, that's a great opportunity to do so. We have merch. This is the High Tea on the High Seas hoodie. There will be a tag in the video to that as well if you're interested in picking something up. If you work in game development, how do you feel that it's changed your experience of games? How does it change the way that you interact with the medium that you work in? Let's talk about this down in the comments. For me, it's made me appreciate a much wider selection of games. Even games that I may not enjoy the gameplay, I can appreciate their craft in a way that I couldn't do before entering the game industry. But put your thoughts down in the comments. I will see you again soon. Thank you.